Hi and welcome, I'm John Arnold. I want to welcome you to this Practical Disciple video. And in today's video, we're going to take a bird's eye view of the book of Leviticus. I really just want to give you a broad sweep of some things to keep in mind as you're reading through the book of Leviticus. A lot of people are very intimidated by the book of Leviticus, or I don't know if intimidated is the right word, but you lose a lot of people when you get to Leviticus and they're trying to read through the Bible in a year. And I think part of that is it's kind of bewildering. We get into all these laws that don't make sense to us about things being clean or unclean and offerings and things about animals, and it just can be a very confusing mess for folks. But I want to peel some of that back because Leviticus is an incredibly critical book. The roots of a lot of important stories and concepts down the road in the canon, in the Bible, are right here in Leviticus. So you don't want to go blowing by it, not paying attention, or kind of cloud over mentally because of some of the minutiae detail that gets covered in Leviticus. The first thing I want to remind you is when you're reading the book of Leviticus is to keep in mind the context of it. Now, Leviticus it starts out, let me just read the first few lines here, and you want to keep this in mind as you're reading. The Lord called Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting, or the tabernacle, some translations will say, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when any of you brings an offering," and then it begins to unfold, and I won't go further than that. But what I want you to notice is the setting. Leviticus begins with God speaking to Moses in the tabernacle. Now this is a continuation of Exodus, if you will. People are at the foot of Mount Sinai, and you got to keep in mind that you've got thousands of people who for decades have been living in slavery, and now suddenly they have been released from slavery. They are traveling and living together, and there is no construct of law for them to abide by, to guide how they interact with one another, to guide how they interact with this God who's delivered them. There's nothing there. I mean, imagine if you just suddenly took several thousand people out of the city you live in and you all just trekked off across the landscape, and it was up to you to figure out how to live together. And there were no laws. There was nothing to resort to as a higher authority unless God was there in your midst, the way He is here in the story of the Exodus and Leviticus and that time in the wilderness for the Israelite people. So keep that in mind. That really drives the content of Leviticus, because what God does in the tabernacle with Moses is basically lays out, here's how you're going to honor me as being holy. And over again you're hearing in Leviticus, I am the Lord, I am holy. Be holy because I am holy. And that word holy in the Old Testament means set apart. It's different from all the things around it. And so, anyways, jumping back, there's two real core things that are important in Leviticus and in what God's saying to Moses, and that is, this is how you relate to me on kind of a vertical axis, and this is how you relate to one another on a horizontal axis. It's loosely laid out in some ways around the commandments, and if you look at the 10 Commandments, the first half really cover how we relate with God, and the latter half how we relate with one another, roughly speaking. Leviticus is the same way. It's to bring order to the relationship with God and order relationships with one another, in the absence of any kind of authority or order whatsoever for them as a community. So now you might begin to grasp why it was so critical to cover all these important details. Because if you ever lived in a community, you know what it's like. You lay down a rule and immediately somebody says, well, what if, or how about, and they start trying to find the edges of that rule. Leviticus is about defining the edges of all those rules of how they're going to relate to one another and God. So in it, you're going to find, we're going to cover things like, starts out with regulations for the tabernacle, for the people and for the priests and how they relate to God in the tabernacle. Offerings, we're going to see in there a lot of stuff about offerings. There's multiple offerings in there, and I'm going to break those down in a separate video. They demand some attention that I can't do all in one shot right now. There's also some things about cleanliness and uncleanliness, and that's not so much a literal sense of hygiene, although that plays into part of it. Some of those laws there are things that God just calls them to be in obedience around, and they have to do with holiness and in being pure before God. There's also the institution of the Aaronic priesthood, the Levitical order, if you will. The initial priests are instituted. There are 2 sons of Aaron that want to go things their own way, and there's some time taken out to talk about that. Holy days. You may have seen the video I did on Pentecost. If you did, you might recall that the roots of Pentecost really go back to the holy days that are established in the book of Leviticus. Sabbath laws, Sabbath rules, they show up in here. The laying out of the Sabbath of the land, that's really a far more core concept than you might grasp initially. A lot of people, when they study what we're going to see later for the Israelites when they go into exile, a lot of people, when they study that, they don't realize that the span of time that they were in exile is rooted in their defiance of Sabbath law in terms of Sabbath of the land, of letting the land lay fallow every 7th year. They failed to do that for 490 years. God removes them for the land for the amount of time that they failed to allow the land to lay fallow. That's a pretty important piece of information. It's rooted right here in Leviticus. Also, as we go over offerings, we're going to get into understanding atonement. Some of the basics of theology of atonement are laid out in Leviticus. So this is not a book that you want to blow through and ignore just because it's confusing at points, or sometimes pretty tedious to read and get through. So slow down, keep your eyes open for some of those things. I'm going to make some other videos for you. We're going to cover, definitely for sure, we're going to spend some time on the offerings. One other thing that I'll lift up before I close this video out, and that is, you remember when Jesus was asked what the most important commandment was, greatest commandment? You'll remember part of that was loving your neighbor as yourself. Guess what? We first hear that in Leviticus. So you see there's some core concepts here that you don't want to miss. I encourage you to take your time. I know it's tedious, but put the investment in it. What makes the difference between the people who want to have read the Bible and those who've read it sometimes is just a matter of having the commitment to read the hard passages. So don't fall off the cart here. Keep on moving through. Blessings on your reading, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.